All right, we have a minute or two here. Let everybody get in here. I guess we have like a minute or two before 9 o'clock. I mean, before 10 o'clock exactly. So give everybody a minute or two.
It is time for Sunday school. It is time
Oh
for
well, that's
Sunday
good.
school.
I'm glad. It needs to happen. That's a good way to do it. Flash the lights, make it seem like Kmart getting ready to close. Of course, only some of the people in this congregation will get that reference. You know, pretty soon there won't be any more Kmarts or Sears or anything. Anything that we grew up with will be gone. All right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of biographical details for a minute. My mother was determined that by the time her sons left the house, they would all know three main things: how to cook, how to clean, and how to sew. So I started with a simplicity pattern. In fact, back in the 70s, Simplicity made what they called a 7-piece simplicity pattern. Anybody remember those? Yeah, right? And it was an entire garment you sewed with only 7 pieces, right? You cut it out of 7 pieces and you sewed it together. And that was my first thing, was a Simplicity 7-piece pattern. And eventually I moved up to sewing an entire shirt. And a shirt is a man's shirt with a collar is a complex thing to sew, you know. Getting all the seams right around the collar and the cuffs, that was a bit of a pain. Getting the buttonholes all in the right place so that, you know, you didn't have these big spaces between the buttons and cloth all curled up. That was quite something. So I started out with a simplicity pattern, and that was my first sewing experience. And any of you guys, let me ask you this. How many of you guys, raise your hand, can time an engine, can set the timing on an engine? Yeah? Yeah, we almost never need to do that nowadays, by the way. Not very many of us, right? Because the timing is automatically set by the computer and all that kind of stuff. But back in the day, we had to set the timing, and we used really good words for timing, like advanced and retarded, right? And when you retard the timing, you set it back before top dead center, right? Just before top dead center, and they're retarding the timing. And then you set it after top dead center. Okay, how many guys in this room can set the timing on a sewing machine? Do you know it's easier to set the timing on a sewing machine than to set the timing on a car? Because all you're doing is you're looking for this little finger to go around on the inside where the bobbin is, and you're watching for that to hit top dead center. And then you want to advance the needle so that it comes up just a little bit before that thing reaches top dead center. That's all you're adjusting. You just want it to come up like 1/8 of an inch before that finger comes along and hooks the thread, because it's pulling the thread tight. Then it comes up 1/8 of an inch, loosens the thread, and that little finger can pick it up. So yeah, if you can set the timing on a car, you can set the timing on a sewing machine. It's really not that hard to figure out. I'm bringing this to you, this message today, or this lesson, because of some of the things we've been going through in Sunday school. Some of the things we've been going through are looking at the complexity that we have in Christ. And in the gospel, the gospel is nowhere near simple. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be explained in simple terms, or that people can't come to understand it in simple language. In fact, a child can understand it. But that doesn't mean it's simple. Like many, many things, you can get to the point where you think driving a car is easy. It's almost like second nature. But that doesn't mean that the car itself is a simple thing. The car itself is a very complex thing. And the same thing with the gospel. That is, understanding something like grace is a tough thing in understanding what it is. But in accepting the grace of God, it's a simple thing. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I would say this. I think it's impossible for you to understand the grace of God. I think it's impossible. I think it is so far beyond us. I think God himself and all that he thinks and plans and does is so far beyond our comprehension that in order for us to understand it, he has to reduce it to human terms. We call that in sort of doctrinal circles as anthropomorphism. He has to put it in anthropomorphic terms. He has to talk about his eyes and his mouth and his hand, even though he's not really like us at all. He has to speak to us in our terms in order for us to understand him at all, but he's way beyond that. And the complexity that's in the gospel gives you an entire lifetime of deep, rich study, but only takes a moment to accept. It only takes a moment to be saved, but you can spend the rest of your life understanding the gospel. But that led some people to ask me this question. What about this verse in 2 Corinthians 11, 3 and 4? But I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if you receive another spirit, which ye have not received, or another gospel, which ye have not accepted, ye might well bear with him. And so I wanted to look at this concept of simplicity for a minute, and I wanted to start with where we were. I want to connect it back with what we studied before. Remember when we talked about marriage, Michael presented that concept that marriage seems understandable, right? So here's this verse that says, I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you a chaste virgin to Christ. And we kind of get the idea of marriage. I know that I'm married. My wife knows that she's married. If she didn't know that, I'd be in trouble, right? If she didn't know she was married to me, I would be in trouble. But when you talk about what is marriage, we end up with this problem. Merriam-Webster defines it this way: marriage, being in the state of matrimony. Now, there ought to be an alarm that goes off in your head right now. It's kind of like the Gong Show. Right? It should be like, you can't use a form of the word in its own definition. But they just did. Why did they do that? Well, here's their explanation for it. The definition of the word marriage, or more accurately, the understanding of what the institution of marriage properly consists of, continues to be highly controversial. This is not an issue to be resolved by dictionaries. Therefore, the best explanation we can come up with is being in a state of matrimony. Isn't that a wild thought? Think, well, this is one of the foundational things to human society. And the best definition we can come up with is being in a state of matrimony. It is what it is. Marriage is being married. Well, turns out it is hard to understand. And it's hard to define in precise terms what it means. I've performed weddings in many states. In the state of Colorado, you can officiate a wedding with no credentials. There is only one requirement for you to officiate a wedding ceremony. You must be over 12 years of age. Now, if you think about that for a moment, that sounds odd. But in another way, it makes a lot of sense. Because I want you to put yourself back in history a little bit, into a mining town in the mountains of Colorado. When you have two families that live near one another, and in one of those families, the husband passes away in the middle of the winter. In the other family, the wife passes away in the middle of the winter. Now we have a mother taking care of children and a father taking care of children. We have no government institution anywhere accessible for the next 6 months. We have no preacher, we have no church, we just have 2 cabins in the middle of nowhere. So what are you going to do? It makes a whole lot of sense to combine those 2 families into one. But you need somebody to officiate the wedding. So who's going to do it? Any one of the children who's 12 or older can officiate the wedding. Isn't that a wild thought? In California, you don't need anyone to officiate a wedding. You can declare yourself married, and you can declare your marriage sealed, which means it will not show up in any statistics. It will not be a matter of public record. You cannot go to the public record and look up, are these 2 people married? It will not show up. Why is that? Every state has antiquated laws that are on their books for a reason. Somewhere in history, it made sense to define marriage that way in California. In New Hampshire, as long as you're recognized anywhere in the country as being able to perform a wedding ceremony, you can perform a wedding ceremony in the state of New Hampshire. Now, let me tell you the loophole that leaves. It means that a 12-year-old child can perform a wedding ceremony in the state of New Hampshire because they can be recognized for it in the state of Colorado. So we have created this situation where marriage is hard for us to understand, and what it takes to be married or to get married is hard to understand. And yet, to know you're married is a fairly simple thing to know. So I wanted to take you this thought for a moment and look at simplicity in Christ. Now here's that verse, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the font sizes a little bit in this verse because I want to point out to you, I want it to become obvious to you what he's saying in this verse. There it is. What he's really doing is comparing these 2 thoughts, subtlety and simplicity. And he's saying that the devil uses subtlety, but Christ has simplicity. And so with that as a foundation, let's start looking at what we can find out about it. The Cambridge Dictionary defines it this way: the quality of being easy to understand or do, the quality of being plain without unnecessary or extra things or decorations. The first one of those, I'm not sure, gives us or instance of being simple. Well, that doesn't help us much. That's another one important to us to understand the simplicity that's in Christ. Absence of luxury, pretentiousness, ornament, etc. Plainness. There might be some things that we can see in Christ that way. How about this? Freedom from deceit or guile, sincerity, artlessness, naturalness. I think there's a lot in there that we find in Jesus Christ. And the lack of mental acuteness or shrewdness, I don't think so. I think it kind of looks like this. How about this? Merriam-Webster, one of my favorite references. The state of being simple, uncomplicated, or uncompounded. Now there's something in there we can use. Lack of subtlety or penetration. Ooh, wait a second. Subtlety is exactly what he accuses the devil of, and simplicity turns out to be a lack of subtlety. Okay. Freedom from pretense or guile. That helps understand the simplicity of Christ. Directness of expression. How about restraint from ornamentation or austerity? Let's see what we can use out of there. Jesus, simple as free from complexity. Now here's where I'd like to open it up for a moment. Is Jesus complex? I can say yeah. Yeah, he's complex. So could it be free from complexity at the same time? In the same way. about if we said, in some ways, he'd be free from complexity, like this. Not be divided into parts. Michael was telling me today about a car that he sold recently, and he said, the engine in this car is made so that it cannot be disassembled. You can't take it apart and fix the engine, right? When the engine goes bad, you have to pull it out and throw it away because you can't take it apart and fix it. Now, in that sense, that engine is not complicated. That is, it cannot be divided into parts. And in that sense, Jesus is simple. He cannot be divided into parts. You cannot take what you want of Jesus and leave what you want of Jesus. You can't take what you want of the gospel and leave what you want of the gospel. If you believe what you want to of the gospel and what you don't want to of the gospel, you don't believe the gospel at all. You believe yourself. And therefore, in that sense, the gospel is simple because you're either going to take it or you're going to leave it. You can't take part and leave part. You can't mix it and match it with other things. It can't be compounded together with idols or with baptism or with the Lord's Supper or with good works. It is uncompounded. It can't be part of another compound. And that is what Jesus is. You're either going to take Jesus only, Jesus ever, Jesus all in all to me, or you will have none of him, and he will have none of you. And if you think you have a Jesus that is not entirely like the Jesus you find in the Bible, then you don't have Jesus. Now, to some of us, that seems obvious. But I want you to note that to the majority of the world, they have been corrupted by the subtlety of the devil away from this simple truth. He is as the Bible presents him. And if you don't like the way the Bible presents Jesus Christ, then you don't like Jesus Christ. And if you like a Jesus Christ that's different than the way the Bible presents Jesus Christ, you like your own imagination. You are enamored with your own vain thoughts. And you have not accepted Jesus Christ. In that respect, Jesus is uncomplicated. I want you to think for a moment of how complicated it would be if he wasn't like this. Now, remember, when you have a car, let me see if I can give you another illustration. When I was in the Army, I had a job for a time driving a Jeep for a major, for the Battalion XO. And the military M151A1 Jeep, which they don't have anymore. They have a, what do you call that thing? The Hummer, right? They have the Hummer now. They don't have the Jeep anymore. But the military M151A1 was built to be as light as possible, which means they did not put matching rings in the transmission. Now, if you don't know what that means, let me give you a brief explanation. What the matching transmission, at the speed of the flywheel on the engine. That way, if you're going uphill and you have to downshift, you just push the clutch, push it into the lower gear, and let the clutch off. And now you're in a lower gear because you had matching rings. When you don't have those matching rings, you have to double clutch. You push the clutch in, you put it in neutral, you let the clutch out and rev the engine, push the clutch back in, and then push it into the lower gear to go up the hill, called double clutching. Now, that's probably more than you ever wanted to know about a manual transmission. And the first time I had to double clutch, I was in trouble. I did not know how to do that job. And it frustrated me to figure out all the sequence of all the things I needed to do to double clutch. But about the 10th time I did it, it was old hat. I knew exactly what I was doing. Pull it out, double clutch, push it in, ready to go. And I say that because I say that the manual transmission is one of the simplest forms of transmission. If you look at in a car with a manual transmission, the manual transmission will be about 12 by 12, a little box. But when you're driving, if you had to compare the complexity, you would say driving the automatic transmission is simple. All you do is hit the gas and the brake. I don't even need a clutch. I don't need to know how to double clutch. I don't need to know any of that. My hand doesn't even have to be on that knob. I can be holding a cup of coffee and drive. So the transmission itself is more complex, but driving it is a whole lot simpler. Jesus himself can be so complex, but think of how complicated it would be if he wasn't so. In fact, that complexity makes your relationship with him simple, because there's only one. If there were two, you would spend your whole life vacillating between which one you wanted to believe. And that's just two. Imagine if there were 10,000. Then you would spend forever. You would be so overwhelmed by choices that you wouldn't be able to choose any of them, and you would be uncommitted to any single direction at all. No, God wanted it to be simple for you. So he put all the complexity into Jesus Christ, in the gospel, so to speak, if you want to look at it from a human perspective. All the complexity resides in God and in the gospel behind the scenes. But for you to understand the gospel enough to be saved, or to receive it the way he said in that verse, accept it the way he said in the verse that we read, for you to accept it is a very simple thing, because there's only one, and you're either going to accept it or you're going to reject it. Now here's a challenge with simple in this sense. We don't like that. Do you know why we don't like it? Anybody got an idea? Why don't we like it simple like that? Black and white. Take it or leave it. Why don't we like that? Come on, somebody's got an answer for me. Why do people dislike that? When you go out, if you thought, well, this is really good news. It's take it or leave it time, folks. God has presented to you the way of salvation in Jesus Christ, him and him only. Take it or leave it. People are not like, yay! God made it simple. No, they're not that way. Why aren't they that way? And don't say rebellion. I don't think it's rebellion. Why don't we like it? Do you like it? Why don't you like it? Because I have to make a defined choice. I have to choose. And here's the problem with me actually choosing. When I make a defined choice and I say, I believe it's Jesus Christ and Jesus only. What did I just say to all of my friends who don't have Jesus? They're lost. What did I just say to all the other religions in the world? They're wrong. So if there is simplicity in Jesus Christ, that he cannot be divided into parts or mixed with anything else, then you cannot think of Jesus and Krishna. You cannot think of Jesus and Buddha, or Jesus and Muhammad. It's Jesus only, uncompoundable, and that automatically marks everyone who believes in Buddha as condemned. That's why we don't like it. Because whenever we draw a line that's very clear and distinct, it's uncomfortable to us. And it's more uncomfortable to us when we think, and I am on the right side of that line, and you are on the wrong side of that line. Part of what makes that uncomfortable is we've been wrong about it before. We've drawn lines like that thinking, I'm right and you're wrong, and found out we were the ones who were wrong. And therefore, for us to draw a line like that says, that's really a challenge for us. Because what if we're wrong? We're going to have to draw a line. And I want you to understand, when you say that it's Jesus only, uncompounded, indivisible, that it isn't you who's drawing the line. You weren't the one. Now you can see how easy it is for somebody to be kind of corrupted by the subtlety of Satan. Because it is so easy for us to want other people to be saved by any means possible. That we don't want to declare them condemned, and we're looking for common ground with them in our beliefs so that there doesn't have to be a division between us and them, and they don't have to be as clearly condemned as what the gospel makes them, because the gospel makes it absolutely clear. You're either saved or you are lost. You're not halfway saved. You either trust Jesus only or you don't. And if you don't, you are not saved. It's that easy. There's other kind of dimensions to simplicity, though. Simplicity is lack of subtlety. Do you ever notice how Jesus has no subtlety? There's nothing subtle about anything he does. When he chooses, when he's walking along one day, and he passes by that pool at Bethesda, and he sees all those people around the pool, waiting for the water to be stirred, and then being able to be put in the water to be healed, he deliberately chooses an impossible case and then instructs him in such a way that it will deliberately, purposefully anger the Pharisees. Challenge them in every way he can. He isn't somebody who went out one day and accidentally ran afoul of the local authorities. He comes on the scene openly defying all the restrictions of the family. So that when the Pharisees decide they're going to trap him, he comes to them and he says, or they come to him and they say, there was this guy who had this wife, and you remember the story, and he dies having no children, the whole thing, right? And they come to him another time and they challenge him about divorce, and they say, well, how are we really supposed to divorce our wives, And he says, from the beginning it wasn't so. Moses, for the hardness of your heart, permitted divorce, but it wasn't supposed to be that way. In other words, he's literally saying Moses was wrong. It wasn't supposed to be that way. He allowed it because he knew how hard-hearted you men were toward your wives, but that's not the will of God. In other words, what you find in Moses isn't the will of God necessarily. He's not gentle, he's not subtle, he's direct and plain. Not elusive or crafty, no pretense or guile, straightforward, natural, and direct in every way. He doesn't beat around the bush. He doesn't, even when you think of the story of the Good Samaritan, which if you want to call it a parable, fine, but if whatever it is, that story is designed specifically to cut the Pharisees to pieces. And it's effective. Think of who he aims at. He aims at the priests and the lawyers, the Pharisees. the Pharisee wasn't his neighbor, and the Sadducee wasn't his neighbor, but the Samaritan was. So that all he has to do then is say, now that you understand, go do likewise. And they just not ask him any more questions, because he didn't have any subtlety. Now, if he was a little more subtle, he'd be like Buddha. Buddhism is full of subtlety. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Famous Buddhist riddle. What is the sound of one hand clapping? And you're supposed to meditate on this until you have some amazing breakthrough of the mind somehow. Very crafty. But in Jesus we find none of that. And that is why people are offended with Jesus. Because Jesus doesn't make any bones about his origins. He clearly says, I and the Father are one. He says, if you've seen the Father, you've seen me. You wonder what God is like? Look at me. What other person could ever have said that? Do you know what the other people say? If you're good enough, you could reach enlightenment and become a god. I didn't quite make it, but maybe you could. But Jesus says, I am. And so there's no guile, there's no subtlety, and he hurts. So Jesus is simple in the sense of an automatic transmission being simple. Simple to drive. In other words, simple for you to understand, enough to be able to accept. Simple in that you don't have to climb a mountain or go to Medina or visit a holy city or enter a holy temple in order to be saved. Simple enough that you don't need a priest to go between you and him in order for you to be able to understand him or him to be able to understand you. Simple enough so that all you have to do is call and be saved. Because everything that's complex about the gospel is in Jesus Christ. So that he himself can present himself plainly, distinctly. He's uncompounded, he's indivisible, he's God. All right? Jesus, simple as austere. What is austerity? Anybody know? We've heard a lot about austerity measures lately. What have the austerity measures been? Very severe. Yes. What else? What's that? Stern. Yes. All the austerity measures that Greece went through recently have been very, very severe and very stern, but of what nature? Pardon? Actually, not positive. Very negative in a way. Why? What was negative about Greece's austerity measures? Have you been paying attention to news? What did they do when they implemented austerity measures? What did it mean for them to implement austerity measures in Greece? Wow, if you don't understand this, then you're missing an economics lesson big time right now. Because you're seeing this economics lesson unfold on the world stage, and it will unfold in your life exactly as it does on the world stage. If you don't understand what's happening on the world stage, I counsel you to take a look. I'll give you the answer, but you need to understand it. So I want you to go out there and look at what was involved in Greece's austerity measures. They cut welfare. They cut back on Social Security, or their form of Social Security. They ended free education for all. College education for all. What their austerity measures meant was very severe, very stern cutbacks in all of the things that made life easy, all the socialist programs, if you will, all the things that gave money away, all the things that made life easy, and they made life hard again for people. That's austere. That's austerity. Austerity doesn't seek the easy way out, and it doesn't try to make things painless for anyone. And do you remember where Jesus uses this term austerity? Anybody remember? He claims to be austere himself. You don't. That's because you remember the story by the wrong title. You remember it by the title of the parable of the talents. But it's not the parable of the talents. The talents aren't the issue. It's the parable of the investor. And the investor is the issue. Remember how this parable goes? A wealthy man had 3 servants, and he's preparing to take a long journey. And so he doles out some talents to each of his servants, and he expects them to do what with that? Invest it for a profit. And one of them chooses to bury it and return it with no profit. Now you would think, that's not so bad. At least he didn't return it for a loss. But listen to what that servant said. He said, I knew that you were an austere man, reaping what you didn't sow. And what was his master's response? He doesn't say, you have misjudged me. I am a kind and compassionate man, and I wouldn't reap what I don't sow. He says, no, you knew that I was an austere man, that I reap where I didn't sow, and yet you still didn't invest this money, and you knew that's what I was expecting. Jesus is an austere man. He expects to get a benefit for his investment more than just the investment itself. When we talk about being led away from the simplicity that is in Jesus Christ, he's talking about his austerity as well. That is, the Lord himself is unornamented and unadorned, unpretentious. By the way, I know this is kind of should be obvious, right? But it's sort of impossible for God to be pretentious. In fact, it's actually impossible for God to be pretentious, because pretentious means to pretend to be something. If God wanted to be something, he simply would be that. Nothing could stop him from being what he wanted to be. And therefore, he can't be pretentious. Therefore, by definition of himself, he is unpretentious. He is morally strict. He is harsh. What was his judgment on that servant who didn't invest for him? He showed his austerity, didn't he? He said, take that money away from him and cast him into darkness. You'd say, well, really? Just because somebody, was not so much of a risk taker as you are? We don't all have the same appetite for risk. You're dealing with God, who expects to get a return on his investment. He's not asking your opinion of the risk. He expects you to act on his behalf, not yours, in everything in your life. When we say, I'm living for Jesus Christ, what we're not saying is, I live my version of holiness and hope that God accepts it. That's not what we're saying. When we say we're living for Jesus Christ, what we're supposed to mean when we say that is, I am living by his priority system, not my own. I don't make my own judgment on these things if he has already judged it. God expects to see a return on investment, and I expect to give it to him. He's going to require it of my hand when I stand before him on the day of judgment, and I will not show him an empty hand on that day. There will be something more than what he invested. Because he's an austere man. He's harsh. Think about all the parables that you know. Think about the parables of the 10 virgins, or of the virgins, the 5 wise and 5 foolish, and the ones who didn't have oil. He doesn't say, oh, well, everybody can make an error in estimation. It's hard to estimate these things, to know exactly how much oil you'll need. And so, you who didn't bring enough oil, well, you can go ahead and come on in. He doesn't say that. He says, you didn't do it right, you're condemned. Think of how many times it works that way in the parables. He's trying to reveal a plain truth while hiding a plain truth. And the plain truth he's revealing is that he is an austere and harsh person. People want to see God like they see, how does C.S. Lewis describe it? He says, a grandfatherly figure rather than a fatherly figure. They want to see him as the old man who just wants to see all the young people have a good time. Not the father who expects his children to be disciplined and responsible and to grow up into adulthood and to take responsibility for their life. He's trying to raise a nation of kings, for crying out loud. And therefore, he needs us to step up and begin to make decisions like kings, expect to run our own life like a king would run it, to act responsible with what he gives us and puts in our hand. And he's austere about it. And it's easy for you to get led away from that by the subtlety that's in the devil. So that you see God more as a grandfatherly figure than a fatherly figure. And if you want to know what kind of a father it would be, think of all the descriptions of a father that Jesus gives us. Because that's what he's looking for. That's what we ought to see him as. All right? So what I've done here is I've taken that verse and I have expanded a little bit with the definitions that we found so far in here. And here it is. And you can see all of my wording is in yellow. But I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his elusive, deceitful craftiness, so your minds should be corrupted from the uncompounded, unadorned straightforwardness that is in Christ. For if he that cometh preacheth a Jesus compounded with something else and loaded with hidden truths, whom we have not preached, etc. That's what he's saying in this verse. You're going to find a lot of people who come to you with all these hidden truths that are in the Bible. Hidden truths that are in Jesus Christ. There aren't any. He has made them clear and plain, so clear and plain that you almost don't want to believe what he's saying. Think about this. Jesus tells a parable about a wedding. And he says a man was having a wedding in his estate, and he sends out his servants to invite all of his friends to come in. And all of his friends send him an excuse, one after another. I'm busy doing this. I have to go bury my dad. I just bought a piece of land. I need to go see it, and blah, blah, blah. And when the servants come back, he makes a two-pronged statement. He says, none of those who refused will be allowed in. But go out in the highways and the hedges and compel people to come in. I want them here for this feast. And so they go out and they compel some to come in. But then he's not done telling the story. He says, later on, the good man was walking through, and he found somebody in the wedding who didn't have on a wedding garment. And he says, what are you doing here? And then he commands him to be bound and cast into outer darkness. God is complex. The gospel is complex. And yet, it is black and white. It is either or. And in God, there is no compromise. If there was compromise in him, if he would compromise at all on what it took to be saved, even in the littlest bit, the gospel would no longer be simple. All the simplicity of the gospel is tied up in this thought that we are saved by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. And when he says that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth and believe in thine heart, what he's saying is, on our part, there is no act that can win for us the favor of God. But that does not mean that there is no line that has to be crossed. Salvation is the crossing of a line, plain and simple. You abandon hope in all other things. Think of the rich young ruler who came to Jesus, and Jesus said, one thing thou lackest, go and sell all that thou hast. And he couldn't do it. Why? Because there's a certain amount of confidence in riches. And he will not share that stage with anything or anyone. He will not be compounded with anything in your life. If you're a Christian and you read the horoscope, I question whether you ought to question whether you're saved. You ought to. If you're a Christian and you meditate to reach some state of nirvana in your mind, you ought to question whether you're saved. Because Jesus will not share the stage with anyone else. He is simple, uncompoundable, unadorned, straightforward, unmixable, with no hidden truth. Everything is on the surface. And so if you wanted to know, well, with all the things we've been talking about how complex the gospel is, what about the simplicity that's in Jesus? There it is. The simplicity that's in Jesus makes for you, your decision, only one decision. In fact, I believe we could say that everyone on earth is only one decision away from heaven. That's how simple the gospel is. Either you have Jesus or you don't. There's no other way. And we'll end it there for today. Thank you.